Welcome to the ID Den podcast, the show for teachers ready to step outside the classroom and into their next chapter. I'm your host, Charity Bosch, and I know firsthand how overwhelming it can feel to leave teaching behind. Whether you're exploring instructional design, navigating corporate culture, or just figuring out your first steps, this show is your roadmap. Each episode will tackle the real challenges, share practical strategies, and prove that your teaching skills are exactly what the world needs, just in a different setting. Let's turn that classroom expertise into your career advantage. In today's episode, I want to talk about how to create effective e-learning. So the problem is that e-learning is everywhere, and the corporate world is drowning in bad e-learning. The completion rates are terrible. The retention is even worse because most e-learning feels like either digital page turning or over-the-top simulations. Stakeholders blame learners when training doesn't work to help improve business problems, but the real issue is we're building courses wrong from the very start. Teachers have an advantage here because you already know what effective learning looks like. You've seen the difference between engagement and entertainment or busy work, and your classroom experience has taught you substance over style and flash. You understand when technology is going to help versus when it's going to hurt. So let's dive right in. You can create effective e-learning by starting with the right foundation. Start with your outcomes, not content. A big mistake I see a lot in the corporate world is building courses around already existing PowerPoint slide decks or binders full of information. Instead, we should be asking what learners need to do differently, not what they need to know. We want to make sure that we're writing our outcomes before we start touching anything else. Content should serve your outcomes, not the other way around. Your teaching background is going to help you here because you have that backward design experience where you're starting with state standards to figure out your outcome and then figure out what content you need to present, what activities you need to have them practice with, how you're going to assess that they've mastered the outcome. You've already been doing what needs to be done that so many other people are skipping. Don't fall for the interaction trap. I don't have a super flashy portfolio. I don't have a ton of super complex, took me weeks to build 15 minutes in storyline type e-learning courses. Most of my e-learning courses are very simple. They have interactions that go beyond multiple choice questions, sure, but everything serves a learning purpose in my courses. I think a lot of times people think that it needs to be this huge production and needs to be super complicated and we need to have talking avatars and all this stuff that isn't really necessary at the end of the day in most cases. Most of the time, it's just going to leave your learners spinning wheels and distracted from the true content because they're so wrapped up in the animations and the flash. Interactive elements added just because the tool can do it doesn't serve any sort of learning purpose. And so learners end up clicking through meaningless hotspots and carousels and things that aren't really adding value to the course. My rule is that every interaction must advance the learning outcomes. It must contribute to them in some way, whether it's tied directly to them practicing and then being assessed on it, or it's a more engaging way to provide the information that goes along with them. I don't include anything that is flashy unless it actually truly serves a purpose in helping the learner master those learning outcomes. Same thing goes for media. Video isn't automatically better than text and images. Audio narration can increase cognitive load unnecessarily. It really should be there when it is necessary or to support accessibility and an option, not required. Your graphics should clarify concepts, not just decorate pages. You want to be using media strategically, not just to decorate a page. Sometimes simple text and an image is the most effective choice. You don't have to overdo it. You don't have to overthink it. Because the cognitive load reality check is that most adult learners also have limited mental bandwidth. If you're offering too many choices, people can get paralyzed with decision making. If you have excessive branching scenarios, it can create confusion, not engagement. Clean, simple design reduces cognitive burden and allows learners to truly access the information and focus their attention on what matters the most. Practice should also be meaningful. Your scenarios should mirror real world application, not just some hypothetical complex loop. Multiple choice questions can be there to do knowledge checks, but they are not going to help you with truly determining if a learning outcome has been mastered and will not aid in performance change in their actual day-to-day job. Make sure that if you're using branching scenarios, you are building in authentic decision-making opportunities, not something that is going to be confusing or distract or be so unrealistic that you lose your learners. I've been through some of those. And make sure that you're providing meaningful feedback in a way that's going to guide improvement rather than just telling them the right answer. These things are super important to let your learners feel safely and learn from their mistakes. You don't want to distract from the true learning, though, by having them make mistakes that they're never going to encounter in real life. And I also want to talk about microlearning. That's a big buzzword kind of everywhere. Everyone thinks that microlearning is the answer to every problem. Oh, that helps with the attention spans that are minimized. Well, that's going to allow them to complete their training in shorter amounts of time. Short does not automatically mean effective, though. So be careful with that. Some concepts are going to require time to develop properly to a place of mastery. You should be incorporating chunking into your content, but that chunking should follow natural content breaks, not trying to force a certain amount of information into 15 minutes. 15 minutes isn't realistic for that information, for practice, for applying what they're learning, for assessing what they've learned. You need to be doing it naturally and not trying to force a ton of information into microlearning just because one of your stakeholders heard it and thinks it's a good idea. Make sure that you're not sacrificing depth for digestibility. If a content needs a lot of explanation, needs a lot of practice in order to develop mastery, you need to give it the time that it deserves. Quality trumps brevity every time. And make sure with your assessments and e-learnings, you're actually measuring learning. So many times, I'm sure you've been through some in teacher professional development. You go through the course, you answer 5 super easy multiple choice questions. Ta-da! There's your certificate. That's not how you're going to build e-learning. You're going to move beyond the basic knowledge checks to performance demonstration, creating scenarios that require skill application, using formative assessment throughout, not just at the end, and again, implementing feedback that's immediate and specific and helps move them forward rather than just telling them what the right answer is, because then they're not going to learn anything. And make sure that you're connecting those assessments back to the learning outcomes, which then translates back to job performance. Now, let's talk about some common mistakes that I see teachers make with e-learning. A lot of times we can enter into this abyss of over-explaining concepts rather than letting learners discover. Just like your child learners, sometimes we just need to present things and let people discover and experiment before we start throwing information at them. You don't need to dive straight into information. I've done some e-learning where it's almost like a little pre-test at the beginning. I'm going to put you directly into the content we're going to cover. We're going to see how you're going to do. And then we start talking about the different things. That's not always the case. Sometimes we go straight into information presentation, but make sure that you're not over-explaining things that people can discover and then have better retention rate because they've done it more naturally rather than just listening to someone talk at them, so to speak. Also, I see a lot of people add too much content just in case. Just in case somebody's really quick, I've got to add 10 extra slides. That's not the case. Make sure that you're adding the appropriate content to cover your learning outcomes. Another issue I see is making courses too linear. Not every course needs to have branching scenarios. Not every course needs to have super complex interactions. Simple is good in some cases, but being too linear and not having people interact with the content in e-learning is not going to help with retention. Another mistake that I see is assuming that all learners need the same level of detail. This is where things get tricky in e-learning because yes, you're kind of building a broad one-size-fits-all course at the base. However, you can build in, especially through branching scenarios, things like that, ways to support those struggling learners or challenge those advanced learners. So, not everyone is just going to need the same level of detail and you just move through it. You can still personalize within e-learning by utilizing branching. Another mistake that I see teachers make is while there are a lot of similarities, sometimes you forget that adults do learn differently than children. Your strategies that you implement in e-learning for adults is going to be different than the strategies that you've implemented for children in your classroom. So you are going to have to make some adjustments. Again, there's a lot more similarities and overlap than I think people would even like to admit between adults and children. But at the end of the day, adults do learn differently than children, especially in a self-paced, asynchronous format that is e-learning. So make sure that you're accounting for those differences in that setting. You need to strike a technical balance. You need to learn the tools well enough to focus on the learning design, but don't let software limitations drive instructional decisions. You still need to be making the best instructional decisions, aware of the software limitations, but don't let that drive your entire course building. I don't even touch the course authoring tool until I've gone through a design plan and a storyboard and SME reviews and all those sorts of things. So I'm not letting the software limitations drive my decisions. I will adapt things once I get into the tool. Granted, I know the tools very well, so I already know what their limitations are. I do have a little bit of bias because I know, oh, it's not going to be able to do that, so I'm not even going to build that in. However, at the end of the day, the outcomes are what's important. And so if there's a limitation within the software, I figure out a way to work around that so that I'm still accomplishing those outcomes. Simple interactions done well are going to beat complex ones done poorly all the time. Because if you get too complex, a learner's going to get confused and then there goes the whole course for you. It's going to be an uphill battle at that point of confusion. So make sure that you're keeping things simple. Consistency in navigation reduces the cognitive load. Make sure that they're not having to go back to the menu, to go back to this slide, to then move on to this next section. And when they're done, they've got to go back to the menu to go to the next place. Try and make it as easy as possible and reduce that friction, because that's going to alleviate that part of cognitive load to really help them focus on the learning that needs to take place. Make sure that you're testing everything yourself from the learner's perspective. When I'm done with an e-learning course, I always go through it start to finish just as a learner would. It always shows issues. If you can, have someone else go through it start to finish as the learner, it will show more issues. I promise you. It takes a couple rounds of, I call it QA, it's quality assurance, before I even send it to the SME to review, because you're so in it, you're so in the tool, you're so in the process that it can be easy to miss certain things if you're not also taking the course from the learner's perspective. Which brings me to a quality control checklist. When you're going through that quality control testing, you need to make sure that you have a checklist that you're using to analyze things. Every element should serve a clear learning purpose. If it doesn't, you need to analyze, why did you put it in there in the first place? And what could be there instead to better serve the learning purpose. Make sure that your navigation is intuitive and consistent. You're not moving from next buttons to arrows to this other thing. Make sure that things are streamlined. Make sure that the content is chunked appropriately for that cognitive load, providing natural mental breaks, providing natural formative assessment opportunities throughout. Make sure that those practice opportunities are mirroring real-world application of the topic you're creating the course around. Make sure that your assessment measures behavior change, not just knowledge. Make sure there's font consistency, especially when you copy and paste things over. Sometimes the formatting can get a little wonky. You don't want one slide to have a very different text than the rest. It's very distracting. So you're making sure that you're going through this checklist, hitting all of these elements as you go through the course learner to make sure that everything's good to go and isn't going to distract from learning, and rather it's going to foster it. Hopefully this gives you some ideas on how you can start building effective e-learning courses, not just flashy fancy ones, Subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts and share this episode with your teacher friends who are considering a change and might be dabbling with creating some e-learning for a portfolio. Connect with me on Instagram at the ID Den. And remember, effective e-learning starts with solid instructional design thinking and those learning outcomes before anything else. Make sure that you have a good foundation before you start diving in and building. Your teaching experience gives you a good addition to that foundation that a lot of other people are going to lack. Focus on those outcomes over impressive interactions. Make sure that all of your content, your media, your activities, your interactions, all of those things all go back to supporting those outcomes and mastery of them. And always keep in mind that a simple, well-designed course beats that flashy, confusing one every single time.